Most people can't afford to buy every new video game when it comes out, so it makes sense to pick and choose the options that appeal to you the most. You want to play games that excite you or perhaps feel like a safe bet, which makes it sting all the more when this goes wrong. How could something you placed your trust in burn you like that? This is where real and often valid gamer rage comes from, investing your money and time into something only for it to let you down. Because I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 disappointing video games that made you rage quit. Number 10, Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy Definitive Edition. It's easy to chastise Rockstar for charging full price for a barely upscaled port of Red Dead Redemption, and you should do it, but in concept, GTA The Trilogy Definitive Edition was a more reasonable affair. 3 classic PS2 games all released as one for $60 wasn't a dreadful deal, until it became apparent that the company hadn't supplied review copies of the game to any outlet on the lead up to release. The marketing was already slim as it was, and people were worried as to why. Of course, their concerns were justified. The game bombed on release thanks to its terrible textures, nightmare-fuel character models, vision-obscuring weather effects, and a new selection of glitches. Not enough attention was paid to crafting an HD experience of the originals, and instead it all felt like it had been upscaled by the mindless push of a button, which, considering it had partially used AI, wasn't totally untrue. There was missing music and cheats, and to make matters worse, Definitive Edition had been designed to replace the old versions that had been pulled from store shelves. It was horrible to see the games in this state, considering that all 3 titles easily added up to well over 60 hours of content. There's no way that the vast majority of players saw it through. You were much better off dragging the PlayStation 2 out of the attic. Number 9, Battlefield 2042. According to Steam charts, the PC player base for Battlefield 2042 started strong on release in November 2021. In fact, on opening weekend, the game hit over 100,000 players, more than either Battlefield 5 or 1 managed in their respective lifetimes. However, this number had halved after the first month, and by the end of the year, the community was a tenth of its original size, and had dropped to fewer concurrent players than predecessor Battlefield 5. Critics gave Battlefield 2042 good but not great scores. However, the franchise's fans were extremely unhappy, leaving scathing reviews wherever they could. There was a laundry list of issues with 2042. The lack of a story mode in the title was already a worrying revelation, but the time had not been spent elsewhere. The game had less guns, less maps, and nonsense changes. Throwing out the tried and tested class system for the new specialist system felt restrictive and stank of desperation because of the microtransactions based on each specialist's skin. The other major change and selling point were the massive 64-player matches. Naturally, this led to a game that most systems could barely run, as was evidenced by the endless storm of glitches and crashes experienced by every Battlefield player. And by the time the patches came, these players had tuned out and gone elsewhere. Number 8, The Quiet Man. Square Enix might be one of the biggest third-party companies in the industry, but they've hardly got an unblemished record. The Quiet Man, which focused on the story of deaf protagonist Dane, might be the most confusing and downright awful title that they've put their name to, however. Trailers didn't say a lot, pun unintended, but seemed to imply a title that seamlessly moved from gameplay to live action and back again. The hook of Dane's disability seemed like an exciting and rare chance for gaming to break new ground and do so inclusively. Surely a deaf protagonist could present an interesting challenge for developers and a chance for a unique gameplay experience. And that might still be the case, but The Quiet Man wasn't the game to do it. Dane's deafness felt like nothing more than a marketing tactic and in fact a storytelling hindrance. The plot was hard to follow, not for Dane, who was used to his deafness and could partake in the world, but for players who were made to experience the game without any audio, subtitles, or any other prompts. His deafness didn't even factor into the story whatsoever, nor the gameplay. The smooth editing of the trailers hid the fact that the 4 to 6 hour experience was largely cutscenes. Despite being a very short title, nobody wants to sit through hours of a story that doesn't bother to explain itself, interspersed with pretty terrible generic combat sequences. Number 7, Crackdown 3. At one point, Microsoft tried really hard to make Crackdown one of their hottest IPs. Their vision for total citywide destruction and mayhem was certainly an inviting one, and the first game landed well. However, its sequel largely reviewed as a bit of a letdown by comparison. Despite this, fans of the franchise were unhappy when the third entry got delayed from 2016 to 2019, but it made for more time to turn Crackdown 3 into something that pushed the series forwards. And gaming at large, in fact, as Crackdown 3 promised to use cloud server technologies like never before. In an impressive reveal demo, the destruction players were promised to be able to wreak was unprecedented, allowing for entire buildings to be toppled into one another. However, in in the final game, this was far from the case. The cloud-based destruction wasn't included in the story, which felt entirely flat and dated without it. And in the multiplayer, where it did seem to exist, it had been severely scaled back. With only around 30% of players unlocking the game's achievement for beating the final boss on any difficulty, it's pretty clear that gamers had felt lied to about what Crackdown 3 was. Number 6. Sonic Heroes. 3D Sonic games weren't always abject failures. For example, Sonic Adventure 2 is celebrated as one of the best games in the series. But then Sonic Heroes reared its head as the precursor of what was to come. This janky 3D platformer had all the issues that came to be synonymous with the Hedgehog and friends, including argumentative camera control and terrible hit detection. It was also far more simple and straightforward compared to the tone that the adventure games had crafted. Fans hoping for Adventure 3 were sorely let down. But once you get past a single playthrough of the game's jank, it's far from over. Sonic Heroes represents perhaps the best of the glut of Sonic the Hedgehog's cast, with there being technically 12 playable characters, all in groups of 3. So whilst you may have beaten the game as Sonic, Tails and Knuckles, you're less than a quarter of the way there. There are 3 more runs to do and an unlockable last story, which are pretty much all exactly the same. Sure, the edgy Team Dark might have more enemies, Team Rose might be easy mode, and Team Chaotix are sent on wild goose chases for items rather than looking for a goal ring, but all 4 teams navigate every zone in the game in the same order. Getting through it once was bad enough, but 4 times? Most people would rather spin dash off a cliff. Number 5. Deathloop. Occasionally a game studio comes along and repeatedly smashes it out of the park so hard that keeping an eye on what they do next is mandatory. Arcane Studios made a real name for themselves with the success of the Dishonored duology, so publisher Bethesda Softworks were understandably keen to hit the marketing hard on their next project. And for a while you couldn't go a month without seeing Deathloop marketing promising a unique roguelike approach to their open-ended formula. The problem, of course, was making the hook of repetition work in a way that kept players invested, which seemed to be a hit and miss affair. Complaints from gamers about having to sit through the same dialogue rolled in, as well as about the game's length, variety and linearity. Even with replaying parts over again armed with new knowledge, the game seemed to be much more restrictive than Arcane's previous work. Where puzzles could be solved in a variety of ways before, Deathloop seemed comparatively boxed in, and worse yet, offered poor rewards for doing so. Complaints were also levied against its poor AI and an unsatisfying story. It's perhaps not fair to say Deathloop angered players so much as bored them until they couldn't take it anymore. At least Arcane could pick up the slack on their next game, right? What was that again? Redfall. It was Redfall. Oh. Number 4. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 was so bad that instead of reviving the skating genre, it nearly killed it off for good. And to be fair, lots of people saw this coming as marketing was slim, but what was shown was more than a little concerning. Complaints about Pro Skater 5's graphics were brushed off by the publisher, who chose to adopt a cel-shaded style to hide its blemishes. It was no surprise that the finished version of the game screamed rush job, but it was way worse than anyone anticipated. Nowhere was this clearer than the day one 8GB patch, which was essentially the entire game, as the disc only contained the tutorial and little else. It stung for die-hard fans as well as the general wider public. There were surely those who picked it up on name value alone. After all, deliberately branding it as the 5th game in the mainline Pro Skater series certainly grabbed the attention of those who had played the originals. Pro Skater 4 by this point was about 15 years old, so was prime for some nostalgia. Pro Skater 5 preyed on those good feelings, delivering a content-light broken mess of a product. Its main story clocks in at around 3 hours, which was more than enough time to drive players away from what little else it presented. Number 3. Biomutant. In a sense, it's easy to feel sorry for Experiment 101, the developers for Biomutant. Their small team's passion for their little third-person action role-playing indie game blew up more than they probably anticipated. With its rodent tribes at war on post-nuclear Earth concept and bright and exciting character designs, it's no surprise that it caught attention. After being scooped up by THQ Nordic, the marketing budget for the game was greatly expanded to take advantage of its natural interest. The problem was that to make back all this marketing budget, the game had to launch at a full price of $60, when really it was still just an indie game at heart. Thus, fans who had waited from the 2018 reveal to the 2021 release date were largely sorely let down by the finished product, as evidenced by the discourse that followed. The world was empty, the quest lines were repetitive, the combat was imprecise, and the story felt incredibly underwhelming. The game's promise of moral choices to be made amounted to 2 identical playthroughs. Almost all of the game's PS4 trophies sit around the 20% completion mark, meaning that those who did part with money for Biomutant spent infinitely more time waiting for it to release than actually playing it. Number 2, Metroid Other M. An underwhelming game can leave you cold in any area, but sometimes make up for it elsewhere. Titles can have a bad story, but you might not care because the gameplay is so addictive. On the flip side, a game might play in a way that feels disappointing, but could have a great narrative and enrapturing characters, so you push through to see the story to the end. Metroid Other M turned off players from both of these angles, making it almost certainly the most abandoned adventure in Samus Aran's history. The character assassination of Samus Aran, who at this point has saved the world multiple times, listening to the orders of a bunch of soldier bros was insulting to long-time fans. But in general, the gameplay is just completely unengaging, trying to combine both 2D and 3D styles and doing so on a solitary Wii remote with no nunchuck makes for an uncomfortable experience, as players have to continuously swap from one to the other by repositioning the controller in their hand if they want to aim at the screen. Not only did Other M make players rage quit, it also caused Nintendo to abandon Samus Aran's adventures for a full 7 years until 2017's Metroid 2 remake. And number 1, Mass Effect Andromeda. When you think Mass Effect, you most likely think BioWare's space opera masterwork. If I were to add the word Andromeda to that, then it will conjure memories of contorted character faces that acted as the red flag that something had gone very wrong. Once a beloved franchise, 2017's Andromeda put Mass Effect to rest for at least 6 years after it was released to critical and commercial mockery. It felt like a cheap, padded version of what fans had been hoping for and thus couldn't hold attention. The proof, as always, is in the statistics. For example, the Legend trophy, which pops at the conclusion of Mass Effect 3, currently has a 70% unlock rate, meaning that most people who played the game saw it through to its end. Comparing that with Mass Effect Andromeda's credits rolling achievement, Mission Accomplished, which sits at a paltry 35%, is incredibly telling. It could be argued that the comparison isn't completely fair, considering Mass Effect 3 is the conclusion to a story people were already heavily invested in, but similarly, the 5-year wait for a new game with a fresh tale in the universe meant Andromeda could be a stepping in point for new fans. Either way, clearly not that many people cared about the game's story or characters to sit through its underwhelming gameplay, or its truckload of facial animation glitches, for that matter. Being disappointed in a game unfortunately leads to rage. However, you can take this rage out on other video games. Here's a list I made on 10 times you're a complete monster to NPCs, and you kinda loved it. Make sure you like this video, leave a comment down below on the games that disappointed you so hard that you rage quit. You can head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.